Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you again. Today, we're going to be doing another episode with my good friend, Fernando Raul Castro Alvarez from Fernando Raul Astrology. Thanks so much for being with us, buddy.
Thank you, Dustin, for once again inviting me to your channel. I hope your audience enjoys our exchange.
I think that they will, Fernando. I'm very glad to be having you here and talking with you. Now, we have already done two episodes where we're doing some general clawing into the validity of different techniques, and we really got to a good place there. Now, this video, I want to aim to talk a little bit more about some specific things that you are discerning about in your practice. Now, just to give us a little bit of a wrap up of the general train of thought here.
Yeah.
A big question that I've wanted to ask you is, what, in your opinion, what is it that makes one astrological technique or school more valid than another?
Okay, there are two things there. One thing are schools and another thing is technique.
Very good. Yep.
Let's talk just about technique first, and then we can talk about the school. So
good.
Before we get into those two subcategories, we have to take into consideration that there's only one astrology, right?
Good.
It's just like math. You might write the numbers in different ways. You might have different systems, techniques, but in the end, you're just dealing with numbers, right? And you're dealing with results and that sort of thing. So astrology is the same thing. So we just have to take that into consideration. Now, there is traditional astrology, which is the type of astrology I'm referring to. And then there is modern astrology, which is the modern, I don't want to say outlook.
Interpretation?
It's the modern, not manipulation, but the modern change in terms of how we see traditional astrology, which is the basic astrology, right?
Right.
So there is modern astrology and traditional astrology. Modern astrology is not necessarily astrology because it doesn't have a traditional outlook on the art and science of astrology. So you got to have those two differentiations, because the question that you're making is easily answered once you understand what I just said about traditional and modern astrology.
Now, I think I see, because you answered when we were talking before, you said, when I asked you what makes a technique valid, you said logic.
Yes, we're going to get there.
So no, so I'm relating to it in that sense that the tradition has a backbone of thought and meaning, and the technique that you're dealing with ought to stand logically with the premise of that tradition.
Yes. And you are supposed to be able to explain it through argumentation, through rhetoric and logic.
Very cool.
So that being said, let's talk about the idea of technique and school. So let's start with technique. I mean, what makes one technique valid to another? First of all, it should be traditional. That's the first thing, right? And the second one, it should make sense and it should be logic, because don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things in traditional texts that do not make sense because men wrote it, right?
Right.
So you got to be able to discern, is this technique traditional? And at the same time, what is the justification behind this technique, right? And, there are a lot of examples that we can get into, right? We discussed previously the idea of the aspects, right? Of the Ptolemaic classical aspects, which is in essence the basis for the Graha Drishti percentage aspect that we see in Jyotish.
Jyotish. So that's like, for example, Saturn's third house aspect has a stronger one. Saturn's seventh and eighth.
Correct.
And Mars has its fourth, its seventh, and its eighth as well.
And that's a good example, because here we see another example within the example I'm trying to show. To a different level, to a different degree. Many people who do Vedic astrology, which, as I've said before, is mainly modern astrology with that Vedic facade, with that Vedic mask, many times say that the inferior planets only have one aspect, which is 180 degrees, which applies to the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Moon. And then they say, and the other planets, the superior or outer planets, do have that aspect, but also have two additional aspects, right? Which we know what they are.
So
and
that's
then they
Mars,
say,
Jupiter, and Saturn.
yes, correct. The superior planets, exactly. And then they say, and that's it, but that's wrong. So you see there how the I don't want to say involution, but the change, the decadence applies once you disconnect, astrology from a tradition. So that idea that there are only 3 aspects for the outer planets and 1 aspect for the inner planets and the luminary, the inner planets and the sun, that's false, because if you go to Parashara, you will see that the Graha Drishti is a percentage aspect more than anything else. Now, and at the same time, coming back to the idea of the techniques that we were, first addressing, the idea is that Graha Drishti percentage table or chart or whatever you want to call it, because you can make a chart in terms of the percentages.
Yeah, like a graph.
Stems from the Ptolemaic classical aspects, which influence the native astrology of the subcontinent of India,
but is not necessarily, those drishtis, those special outer planet aspects are not necessarily part of the native traditional Jyotish astrology.
Correct. Yes. No. I believe that the idea of aspects, that is purely Hellenistic in my opinion. But it did change within the Vedic practice, and we can discuss about the differences.
Right. But that's cool.
But the thing is that you see here, because the people who study traditional, or at least try to do it more traditionally, will understand this about drishtis and other techniques within Jyotisha, right? But many people who do not understand the backbone, do not understand the background more than anything else, won't be able to know, and will just repeat the idea, the simplification that you only have 1 and then you have 3. No.
And
you
this
have
is the
planets aspect everywhere. The thing is that the only place where they have 100% Graha Drishti power is within those spaces that I asked. So I'm just, explaining all this, but the idea is that a technique has to be logic, and it has to have some sort of traditional background. Now,
that can be
a person might say, well, where does innovation come in? Well, innovation comes in, yeah, but it has to fill the voids. And if there are no voids, then there is no need for innovation, right?
And that innovation still needs to be applied under the ruling logic of the original pretenses of that tradition.
It's just like law. It's just like law. It's just like religion. It's just like any sort of systematic traditional way of
I almost feel like there's as an example. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Pal. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. That this is the way in which traditional schools or traditional institutions pass down wisdom and knowledge. It's not an anarchy like most people believe.
That's what I was gonna say, is like, if you try to, if you take like a person from another country and they have a certain type of law that they're used to in their country, they bring it to America, or India or wherever, right? If you bring it to America and you try to say, this is what we do in our country, the context of American culture will not resonate with that bastardized idea of law.
That's yes, but no. Yes, but no, because you're using a modern example.
Yeah, okay.
And in the modern example, the differences are going to be really drastic. So it will apply within what you're saying. But it will apply only within the modern paradigm. Because if you take a traditional Indian society from, I don't know, 1,500 years ago, and you, for some odd reason, well, that won't be a good example between India and the States, because there's no connection. But if you take an Indian and you move them to Egypt 1,500 years ago, the differences are not going to be that big. They're just going to be cultural, regional. But the idea of the way people live, the systems, the society, the idea that there's a king, there's God, there's religion. I mean, the similarities are going to be a lot more than today. But what I'm trying to say is that the technique, what makes one technique more valid than the other, is all the things that come before the technique, right? You can't just say, well, it works, which is something that a lot of people say. Well, that is a utilitarian
philosophy
argumentation in terms of what you can get out of it. In astrology, it doesn't matter what you get out of it. The idea is that it makes sense, that it's logic.
Yeah, because I think there's a great Indian story of a gentleman who's got 2 coconuts, and he's watching these 3 crows on top of a branch. And he hits the coconut and he watches, and the crows don't move. He hits the coconuts a second time and the crows don't move. He hits the coconuts a third time and the crows scatter. And the person says, therefore, because I hit the coconuts, the crows moved, it must work. It didn't work every time, but the utilitarian philosophy, I think,
Okay, now I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The utilitarian philosophy thinks that the crows moved because the coconuts hit, but they didn't hit every time, which means that there might not actually be a causation. But a lot of people in today's times will just say, look, it works in the way that I
agree. I agree. And that also stems from the crisis of modernity in terms of how we see modern science, because there is no paradigm. There's no paradigm difference between religion and science. Only within modernity is that they are divided, right?
Wonderful.
So
I always love that.
To round up this question in terms of technique, now we're going to get to schools.
Go for it.
The idea that technique, first of all, it has to make sense. It has to have some sort of traditional background, and you got to learn. You got to know, because and that's the problem, that many people who learn astrology today are not willing to go that deep, because what is taught today is not real astrology, because you got to have a whole background. Once again, in terms of simple theology, simple logic, simple rhetorical abilities, you have to have a historical background. It's like really studying for something. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
especially astrology, which in my opinion is the most interdisciplinary thing you can dedicate yourself to. There's nothing
and I almost
more interdisciplinary. Maybe theology would come before that, but the idea is that astrology is very varied, and you have to take that into consideration. But most people today are not willing to go that deep or delve, or even waste time in that, because they just see astrology as entertainment, not like
and they're looking for the quickest
art and science.
They're looking for the quickest grip to match their
correct.
It's not very scientific if you're just looking to confirm your bias. You know what I mean?
Also, that's also part of it. Yeah.
Right. So, and I think so. It's even possible that there are various valid traditions of astrology, as long as there is a conception at the basic level of the astrology, and the techniques are involved in the logic of the premise of that tradition. Then there could be various traditions who use techniques and even use planet aspects in different ways. But as long as they're valid to the tradition, and therefore work with the logic of what they're trying to see in a horoscope, then it is valid enough in its own way.
Yeah, but one thing is important. There's only one tradition. So it's going to change inevitably, but only in tertiary situations, tertiary locations that are not the main part, right? The main part has to be the same.
Just like math.
The idea, for example, the same in astrology, there are 7 planets, that is something that will not change. Yeah. So there's got to be like a spinal cord, and then the other stuff, the limbs and everything. Remember, you can survive without your arms, without your legs, but only with your torso and your head, right?
And your head.
Well, that's the thing, that even though there's one tradition, there are going to be different things that are going to express themselves in different ways, in different regions, throughout time, throughout cultures. So they're going to be, these are the things you are alluding to right now.
Yes, gotcha.
But you got to take into consideration there's only one tradition now.
Very good.
Now, that being said, in terms of schools, first of all, you have to realize there are no schools of astrology today. There are no paramparas, there are no lineages. I mean, and what do I mean by that? You can't go to a guy that says he's the student of the student of the student and connect all the way to, I don't know, Neshespo, Petrosiris, or Parashara,
or Narayana.
And even and the thing is, Dustin, that a lot of people in India do say they can trace that lineage,
right?
And that's highly improbable. And most Westerners will will believe it, because they're Westerners. They don't know anything about India.
They're infatuated with the guru.
Oh no, and not only that, they just don't know how India is.
Yeah, you're right.
They idealize it, and India is a place that's very complicated. I mean, it's like 15 official languages, and then you have
historical dynasties,
80 languages that are not official.
Right.
Like, you live here, and like 20 kilometers away, they speak another language. I mean, there's a lot of things.
No kidding.
India is very syncretistic, and that is something that you have to take into consideration. And many astrologers today would say that they can trace their lineage back to Parashara, and that's very highly unlikely. First of all, Parashara, we do not know if he even existed, right? We can say that Baraja Mihira did exist, right?
Yep.
But he's posterior, and there are records for him. But Parashara, we don't know. He's like the son of a rishi, or one of the 7 rishi of the Sapta rishi. So, there's a lot of things that supposedly some Indians would say it's really traditional, but you gotta take that into consideration.
It's just like the figure of Jesus Christ in the Western tradition.
To a certain degree, yes, I would say yes.
Yeah,
the difference
that's
is
a good answer.
The difference is that Jesus did found a church, and there is an apostolic and physical lineage back to him. So
say that he led.
That's something
cool.
that we can trace, but we can't trace like a school of astrology which is standing since I don't know, 5,000. Yeah, you can't do that. So you have to take into consideration there are no schools. So what we have are residues. What we have are vestiges. What we have are old texts. What we have is maybe an oral tradition that more or less is there dispersed, and the part of oral tradition is very in the question, because we live right now in a world of ruins, right? Which is modernity. A world in crisis, which has decided to separate itself from God, right? And that has inevitable repercussions among human life. And we are living that, since that is the norm in our tradition for now almost 3 centuries.
No kidding. That's almost like the Kali Yuga idea, is that
correct.
Earth has these sort of diving into the blackness periods in order to make the gold within that much more meaningful.
But that is the Indian perspective. That is not the Mediterranean Christian or Judeo-Christian perspective.
Right. Yep.
There's another, and that's not, and even though it's very similar, that idea of the Yugas is not the same as the ideas of the ages of Hesiod in Greece, where there is a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. And the iron age, it corresponds to Kali Yuga. But this is the idea of looking at time. And now that you touched upon this subject, it's very important to understand how traditional man saw time and how we see time. They're 2 different things. Traditional man would see time as a living thing, as something that did not repeat itself. That's something that had magic in it. That's something that permitted us to measure the planets and everything in order for ourselves to align with superior forces, right?
Superior
Modernity
logic.
sees times as something inert, something purely theoretical, mathematical, something that can be subtracted and added. It sees it from the numerical perspective.
Right.
So
that's a good way to put it.
Those 2 things are very important, once again, to understand the modernity traditional dichotomy. Okay. So going back to the question,
psychedelic.
Yeah, yeah. To
a
certain degree, that would be a nice adjective to describe what I'm saying. But it is, and it's even worse. If you only knew how bad things are, like
I get it. Very good.
But the thing is that, going back to the question, trying to recover my line of thought here, is that
we were talking about schools.
The schools of tradition. Yeah, there's only one tradition, but there are no schools today.
Gotcha.
So they're only
nothing
vestiges.
is connected in that way.
Correct. There is no lineage.
Right. This is good for us in a modern
and not only that.
Yeah.
And not only that, since there's no lineage, there are only vestiges, books. There might be an oral tradition, which was what I was going to say. But the fact is that even though it is a world in a crisis, the only place where the tradition is still alive is in India.
Right.
So that is the importance of Vedic astrology in today's context for the person who wants to study astrology. Because even though India is a modern country, and it is, even though there's a war in India by liberals and by Marxists and by social activists or social parties who want to destroy all that tradition, just the same way they want to destroy it in the States and Europe.
No kidding.
Because it's the same subversive force going against tradition.
Right.
But in India, that subversive force has to take the Indian the Indian costume,
backbone.
not the Indian costume, which is they're gonna make war on everything that is Vedic. Just to let you, for your audience out there,
That's very
today in the States and Canada, there are a lot of people who call themselves liberal anarchists. They're just, they're just part of the times, and they will be vegan, right? Right? They will have some sort of vegan diet or vegetarian, but vegan is the most extreme. You go to India, that same young man, young woman who calls herself or himself a atheist, anarchist, social liberal will go for eating meat in India. Why? Because that is the way of destroying the tradition in that place, right? You see, it's the idea of subversion. That's the only thing that matters, of modern subversion of destroying the tradition.
Wow. So that is that's very, very
it's a war.
Cool
it's a war against
Fernando.
truth. It's a war against truth. It's a war against, the spiritual,
what we've always
the religious.
Had, the spiritual and religious truth that we've always
The thing
held
is that
to.
it mixes itself with modernity and liberalism.
It's interesting.
And when I mean liberalism, I mean like 18th century liberalism.
Like
I'm
any
referring,
idea should be free to be talked about, and
the idea of just having a society outside of God, having a secular society, which has stemmed throughout the centuries into, a perennial revolutionary impetus,
and
based
Fernando,
on a global subversion. But let me finish the question, Dustin.
Go right ahead.
Because I want to finish the thought, because we have taken a lot of tangents. But going back to the idea is that there are no living schools of astrology today. There are no paramparas. There are no lineages. Astrology has been dead in our society for a long time. The only place where it is still alive to a certain degree in its more or less traditional form is in India.
Right.
So what is the differences between different schools? You have to realize what is traditional and what is modern. And you will see that if you're a person who goes to astrology because you are a logical person, because you're a person who wants to find truth, right? If you're a person who wants to reconnect really with the transcendent, with the spiritual and the religious, then you will learn traditional astrology. And if you're a person who goes to astrology for other reasons other than that, and believe me, there are a lot, both bad and good, but mostly bad, right? Then you're just gonna believe anything. And you're just gonna believe anything that feels good with you. And that's the differences between modern and traditional schools or ways of doing astrology. So the traditional school, to a certain degree, even though it has different cultural, historical manifestations, India, Islam, medieval and Renaissance Christianity, even though it has different cultural situations, it's still traditional till the early 18th, late 17th century, when the scientific revolutions really began to take hold. Now, from then on, you have more modern astrology, or more modern counter astrology, where we start seeing the ideas of modernity applied to astrology, the idea of evolution, which is
you
false.
said those the 1700s that really kind
of we're talking about the scientific revolutions, the idea of heliocentrism, the idea of how Protestantism takes more hold and what that creates in those countries in terms of economy and all that. We're also talking about the exploration, or the start of globalization, or even though there's a lot of ideas in terms of when globalization started, but one of the many hypotheses is that started in the 16th century with the discovery of the New World. Yes, correct.
Gotcha.
But besides that, I'm sorry.
No, it's
what
okay.
was I going to say? Yes, that modern astrology, what it does is applies modern ideas like evolution, like liberalism, something as simple as the sexes. Astrology was never ever in the hands of women. It was always for man, by man, forever. And that is the way of doing traditional astrology. But within the modern context of total emancipation, of the abolition of hierarchies, right? Because the abolition of slavery did not mean the abolition of slavery. What it meant was the homogenization of slavery and the destruction of the hierarchical or what was left of it in the late 19th century. But the idea is that all these ideas are applied to astrology, and then astrology does not become astrology, it becomes something else. And then when the 20th century comes, you have all this commercialization with astrology, which started with the horoscopes, which started in the 1930s. And you see here something that began in the 19th century with the modern ideas, how today in the 2020s is just, simply a caricature of things. So you have to have the proper background the proper, understanding to see what is traditional and what is modern. And what I would recommend to finish this question up is that you go for the traditional, because that is what is logic. That is what is connected to a tradition, to a lineage, right?
Yeah, because really when I feel it, like I almost feel like the tradition is like the bones that can be made and taken into a broth. And if you don't have those bones, then you're just like trying to get the water or the broth of the thing, and it's not really the same thing.
Not only that, you're just having the water and it tastes like water. And you say, no, it does not taste like water. It tastes like
there's,
try it. Yeah. And you drink it and say, well, and everyone's for me, it tastes like, I don't know, like orange juice. But in the end, you're just crazy people talking about the taste of water. So that is modernity to a certain degree. And that's the situation today. It's just a war against truth. And this little exchange that we're having only reveals the war that has been going on to a certain degree, because I haven't spoken about a lot of other things against astrology.
Very interesting.
But the same thing could be said about biology.
Because
the same thing about chemistry, but the same thing about philosophy, the same thing about history, the same thing about almost everything, because it is a war on truth. Hence, it is a war on all the fields of learning and understanding.
One thing I will say, Fernando, I think is kind of interesting, and I'm going to try to relate this in a very Scorpio way. Okay, I'm thinking about how I'm going to try to relate this in a metaphor. If I'm around the arm of a girl at a party, and everybody is very interested in this girl, if she's some super hot girl, and I'm walking around at this party, if I have tradition, if I'm really with this girl and I really dig her, I don't have to be worried about all the other people coming and trying to take her away from me.
Yeah, the security. Yes, there's a security. You have a strong self-esteem.
Right, exactly.
You are a natural player.
That's right. And I do try to be when I can, when I have a good lead. Now, in the same way, I would imagine that the subversive force of modernity is kind of like those people grabbing for my girlfriend, and me having a stable, secure girlfriend is kind of like having tradition, having some kind of deep sense.
Yes, it is a very particular way of putting it, but you're correct. Yes.
And the reason I'm bringing it up is because I've had the experience where if I'm with a very pretty girl and we hang out with ourselves all the time, it's nice. It's its own thing, and it's really the center of the relationship. When you go out to parties and to socialize, it makes you feel even deeper about your security, knowing that other people are grabbing for your girl, but she wants to go for you. In the same way, there is a satisfying tantra happening with the subversive force of modernity, putting pressure on tradition to remain as strong as it is, to remain.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah,
you see where I'm at there.
But but you gotta. It's a more of a quality versus quantity thing, and yes, that quality is being reinforced by what you just said. Yeah,
I think so at some level, and that's part of the reason why I always try to look at whatever's happening on planet Earth as being in the narrative of Vishnu's caring intelligence.
Yes, it is.
I think that if
things happened, it's because God permits it. Yes.
And I think that God is permitting this to happen because it's just it's the classic thing of Adam and Eve, and they have to delve into the deluge of Maya in order to see the meaning and truth of that spinal staff of Moses at the top of the mountain.
But the thing is that he's permitting it. He's not doing it. We are doing it. That's
I love that, Fernando. Yeah. That's psychedelic.
because in the end it's not art. It's not natural. It's artificial. You see, it's like God permits it to happen. Now there must be a plan within it, right? And everything that is permitted, is permitted by God. But the thing is that we are doing it, and we're doing it out of wickedness, out of evil, which once again, evil, wicked, all those things. If absolute truth exists, then absolute evil exists.
Yes, and I'm with you. I almost feel like,
and that's the idea that we're in.
Thank you, Fernando. Sorry. Like what I was going to kind of say is that, in a society like ours, we don't like to be too conservative. Nobody does. So, for example, drinking beer is something where everybody can fall off the rails on. but we don't want to make it illegal.
But that's the thing, Dustin. People don't understand what conservative means.
Yes,
because
I understand.
when people are saying that they're conservative, they're really the radicals of 250 years ago.
I believe it.
And the radicals of today will be the conservatives of 250 years in the future. Because once again, it is a society that is becoming. It's not a society that is, right?
Very
so
psychedelic.
Conservatives today are not. They're the revolutionaries of 250 years ago. It's not about it's they're really not that conservative. They're just
But I guess
the same thing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's okay, Fernando. My main point I wanted to make here is that with regards to God giving us license to completely destroy ourselves per se, this is where I'm at with it, is that you like to use beer in our society. We don't want to make it illegal, but there are some people who suffer from that freedom. There are people who will let that freedom completely bear them out and ruin their lives. But those of us, and this is like us as religious people, religious people, we can't be dogmatic about saying that everybody has to be theologically inclined, because that's kind of what happened in the Dark Ages in a lot of ways. Science has allowed a certain freedom, which has given rise to this subversive force of modernity that can be anarchistic about traditions. But I think traditions and God and the inherent truth of knowledge are strong enough to bear the grabby hands of that submersive force of religion. And so that's why I think that we shouldn't be, we should allow alcohol to be legal, even though people can grab
drugs should be illegal.
And in the same way, I'm glad that God gave us license to write to ourselves and to not be robotic.
That's what I wanted to say. That many things today that we consider that by conservatives that are bad are just they're just manifestations of the same revolutionary impetus. Because drugs, plants and fungi and alcohol should be legal.
Totally. Freedom of consciousness.
Totally. No.
So Fernando, this is.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. It's
I just wanted to say that
ahead.
That most of this, that's just puritanical rhetoric, which is not necessarily conservative. It's just part of that subversion, because that puritanical from our tradition stems from a Protestant movement which went against God. And the Protestants of the 16th century are just like the communists of the 20th century.
Oh, wow. That's
so it's the subversion. And at the same time, that same subversion is the one that tells you the main point of history, where they say that the Dark Ages were really bad and dogmatic. But to the contrary, the Dark Ages represent the organic way that we are supposed to live in terms of our tradition. But obviously, since the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, all that is considered backwards. All that is considered negative, when the majority of the people were living like most people who are aspiring to be totally organic, totally nature balanced. That's the way they lived back then. At the same time, there are other things that we can take for example. But the thing is that subversiveness is more prevalent than you think. And what I was going to tell to you is that you said that sometimes God might give us license and we spoil it. Well, that's the norm. That's what humanity is.
Right.
That's the idea of the fallen state. That's the idea of just being imperfect, right? And that's why we need a relationship with God, because that is the only thing that can save us from having the situation where we just derailed ourselves, which is not necessarily the norm, but from a spiritual perspective, many times it is, especially
it's a norm in
today's society.
It's like the Christ consciousness. It's the recurring. It just there it is. It is a thing that does happen. Yeah. So, Fernando, I love that we went on a theological run there, because you are so good with them. Now, we've got a bit more time before we end our video here.
Already an hour? That was fast.
Well, not quite an hour yet. We're about 45 minutes in.
Okay.
So I figure our last 15 minutes, maybe I could quiz you on a few questions of specific astrological techniques that I've been curious about your take on.
Okay,
now, we've already talked about the Graha Drishtis, which was interesting. Now, something that you've told me that you don't use as much in your practice these days is the Vargas.
Yes.
Now, we had a nice little tangent talking about Mahadashas and Nakshatras and the fact of Ayanamsha, and that's a whole different conversation. Maybe it's another one that you and I could have. But I'd like to first ask you, what is your...
But by the way, this is not a pop quiz. This is like a doctorate's exam, because I have to give a plan. I have to give a long explanation. Yeah.
Well, so what do you think?
I just can't say no.
All right.
I can make it fast, but yeah.
I'm curious about the Vargas. Do you think?
Okay, the Vargas.
Even if we just hit that, and we can always ask about more.
Okay, sure. The main problem is the sidereal zodiac.
With the Vargas.
Yeah. No, with everything stemming. Remember, the majority of the techniques in India stem, not all of them, but the majority stem from the Nakshatras. And there is a problem. There is a big problem with the sidereal zodiac. Big problem. Which has. Yeah, but the thing is that even though we've seen people like our teachers talk about it, unfortunately, the argument goes deeper, and at the end, you can't use the sidereal zodiac in any way. Doesn't matter what Ayanamsha you use, because there's no such thing as a correct Ayanamsha. And if you use the galactic center Ayanamsha, it's not traditional, because we are the center of everything, not the center of the galaxy, right? Galaxies, even though we can see them with technology, do not exist. What exists is our soul, right?
That whole thing,
and our connection to God, which is once again geocentric, which once again was the cosmovision or the worldview of traditional Sanatana Dharma.
But so does this give the space for the idea? Someone like Vic Takara, for example, for example, he's got this whole idea that the sidereal aspect of the stars around our galaxy do have a spatial resonance and a luminary resonance with karma, and they do give the resonance of the nakshatras. He just doesn't necessarily put it to like the Lahiri Ayanamsha. He uses an Ayanamsha though, and he still uses nakshatras and Vargas and Mahadashas. Of course, he's one of many who have an idea of what's the right idea. So for him, his thing is like, Kritika starts at the beginning of Aries, typically.
Correct.
In his consciousness. And that's just like many of our teachers who abide by this as well. Ashwini doesn't begin Aries, Kritika does. This is this idea. So there is a idea of a tropical base, or a tropical nakshatras within a tropical.
Correct. That's the correct way to put it. Correct.
Right. So
what I was going to say is that what he is doing and other people are doing is that he's combining two different
traditions.
Two different cosmological visions of reality, right? If it's not geocentric, it cannot be astrological, hence it cannot be traditional. So if you're gonna
nakshatras could be considered geocentric.
Yes,
though, no?
yes, they are. But I'm first talking about the idea of the galactic center Ayanamsha, because before I get there. So
because he doesn't use galactic center.
Correct. He uses, I believe, the one you mentioned.
Right.
As many others use many other Ayanamshas, right? So the thing is that is discarded, right? The idea of having the idea of stars with a galactic center. Unfortunately, you can't do that because we live in the center of everything. So it is geocentric cosmovision. Now, that does not have to do with flat Earth. That's another topic we're not going to discuss. It's just the center of the world. So now, in terms of how do we fix the sidereal zodiac, there's no right answer to it. There is no right answer to it. They're just opinions. They're just opinions. And not only that, even though it's a traditional thing, stars are moving. And that creates a whole nother problem that people acknowledge, right? That people recognize it exists, but its implications are really shattering to a lot of things.
The thing about, again, because I would venture to say, because again, I mean, I really lean a lot on Vic Takara, and I should tell my audience that I am not Vic Takara. I don't know his exact opinion on things, but an example he's given is that he is aware that those stars don't look the same way that they did 3,000 years ago. So even, when we talk about tropical astrology, we often talk about the idea that since the stars have moved since about 3,000 years ago, the beginning of Aries, for example, is a tropical phenomenon, which has nothing to do with the sidereal stars. In the same way, if the sidereal belt, or if we should say the space around our galaxy, thinking without the stars, if there is a space around our galaxy and there is a galactic Aries, where if the sun is here, let's say this galactic Aries is Kritika, which some people now say has moved into Taurus, let's say. So let's say this galactic Aries, which is Kritika. Let's say if Kritika is now in what we call a tropical Rashi of Taurus, then there is a sidereal emphasis, but the stars are irrelevant, even though those actual illuminated stars have moved and changed and don't have any real.
That's the problem. He's using modern ideas within a traditional perspective, and once again, the solution from a traditional perspective, from my experience, is to leave the sidereal zodiac forever. You just have to do tropical astrology, and that's why I'm doing more now. Things that have to do with Perso-Arab, Islamic, and things that have to do with Hellenistic and medieval and Renaissance, because they did recognize the situation with the stars. And the Indians did not, once again, because of the native techniques that were there in the pre-Hellenistic astrology, that Jyotish was part of the sixth Vedanga, the sixth Vedanga, which was Jyotish, which was the one that you needed for time. So the point is that, I know the idea is that Kritika and in the mentions of the Nakshatras in the Vedas, you will see that the enumeration starts with Kritika and ends with Bharani, right?
And that could just be its own moving thing. That's why I'm saying that that could still be considered geocentric, and that the planets.
No, it is. But the thing is that before Kritika, it was in another, and the problem is, and that's a whole nother thing that we haven't discussed, is how Nakshatras are seen within the purely Vedic context, and how they are seen once the Hellenistic influence comes in.
Okay, on that I'm with you.
Those are two different things.
I got you there.
Because the idea is that they were not used for natal astrology.
Yeah, they were used for more prajna.
They were used for not prashnas. They were used for muhurtas, the idea of elections.
Gotcha.
And they were elections to do sacrifices, to do ceremonies, to do religious works, which did not have necessarily the impetus that a natal chart has, and its applications within dashas and Vargas. Now that's another thing. But coming back to your question, the sidereal zodiac, I don't use it. So hence, the ninth division of how we get, now Amshas. Even though it's not necessary, because that's another thing which most people don't talk about, the idea of the stars and the yogataras and the divisions within in the natal chart. Even though you could say they're similar to each other, or they stem from each other, I believe they're two different things, because this is one of the problems why people say that they don't mesh. And I believe is that they don't mesh because they're two different things. And some people use it as an excuse to connect them. But the thing is that when you use divisional charts, you get into problems, because there is not one way to make them. Okay, there are different ways to make them. The Navamsha obviously simple, but like the Drekana, there are different ways to make them.
Right. Yeah.
The higher ones, and some people use other. And remember, from a traditional perspective, there are only 16.
Right.
There are no more. Everybody who's just inventing new Vargas charts, don't listen to them.
The idea.
Don't listen to them. Go and look for, because it's just the same thing. People who are talking about 100 and yo no sé qué carajo Vargas, are just like the people who are saying that they are contacting with aliens, and you got to build a ship. That's our Western idea that you see with
the
people
modernity
who use
thing. I'm interested in extraterrestrials. You and I could have a funny conversation about that.
ETs, they don't exist. What does exist are spirits. Because once again,
unincarnate. Okay, we did talk about that.
Yeah, because there's no way. It's not. Once again, that's a modern idea. You didn't start talking about aliens until very recently,
Right.
19th century.
So it could be
Before
an
that, there were
imaginated
spirits,
thing.
there were ghosts, there were,
Gotcha,
devils,
gotcha.
demons,
But
angels, that sort of thing.
just to reel in where we're at here, because I want to ask you, Fernando, I want to see if
Yes,
I'm
I don't
reading
use
this correct.
I don't use Vargas anymore
So
because of these reasons, and at the
but
same time, the techniques within the Navamsha are just, I mean, they're inventions.
and
They're
you
just
think that
made up.
they're those techniques, like, okay, so let me just throw, if I'm
Except
not, if go ahead.
because let me just be clear with that, because I
Sure.
just said something very very important, or at
Inclusive
least very
or
very controversial among
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
circles, because they're made up. Because you hear people say that the Navamsha is the second part of life, and that the Navamsha is this, and they're just inventions. When you go to the books, first of all, the Navamsha is for as Parashar states, it's for partner.
Yes.
It's the chart of the wife.
Right.
Wife, not husband, wife.
Wife.
That was the main emphasis, because this was made for men. Women were not going to astrologers in the Vedic context. They were in their houses, cleaning, cooking, raising children, because that was the tradition. Okay.
Right.
So, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will apply to men for women chart. So there we have a problem right there.
Right.
So
I mean,
the second thing is, let me just say that even though it's ninth, and Parashara says that, there are no other specific implications of what the D9 is. Now, you can get implication through other texts, right? The D9 is very important for Jaimini techniques, but Jaimini techniques, Jaimini is a book that is written in code. And Jaimini, there are a lot of things that you can translate correctly, and there are a lot of things that people translate in many ways, and hence there are problems. That's why Jaimini is just like a puzzle, and many people teach it in different ways because it's a puzzle. But whatever, the point is that from the D9 you can get the Karakamsha, and you can get certain techniques.
Right.
But once again,
but
within Jaimini and the further techniques, things get complicated depending on who you take classes with. I took Jaimini with 3 people, and the 3 people taught it in different ways.
Yes,
but not contradicted. There were, that's why, for example, people said there's 7 kakas. Right. Other people said that there are 8. That's the thing. It's a problem with translation. So that's another use that we have traditional for the D9, but it's put into, into question. And the last one, which is the most obvious one that people know, is the idea of the exaltation and debilitation. The idea that if it's exalted in the D9, debilitated in D1, then it gets canceled. The idea of vice versa, that situation. Yes. Vargotama would be another thing. Exactly. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So those are the only 3 things that you can get out of the Navamsha through studying, right? And that thing about the exaltations and debilitations, you get it because the writers usually speak about it. But everything else is just conjecture. Everything else is just conjecture, and it will depend on the person you ask, because there was never anything written about how to read the Navamsha other than what I just said. And the same thing is with the other charts. And with the other charts, sometimes it's even worse because there's less information.
The other Vargas.
Yeah, and the thing is that, I don't use them because it's not logical. Like,
well,
why is the 9th the chart of the wife? Well, people will say that the 9th is the chart of the wife because it relates to the 9th, which is marriage. But the thing is that the 9th in other astrologies is not marriage. Marriage is the 7th. 9th is the house of God.
Well,
9th is the house of religion, of tradition.
Yeah.
So there are many things. And people say, well, the thing is that you come into God through marriage because it can be the ashram.
Like Ryan Kirksack's idea of it is that true marriage ought to be a function of your divine surrender. So if you are in today's modern times, the church or the ashram that most people are going to belong to is the householder of marriage. And so if you have a connection of your 9th lord, and if you got good shit happening in your Navamsha, it means something that the marriage that you do get is going to have the devotion of God consciousness. The 7th house just basically means how your marriage partner is going to be. But the 9th house means how much of your connection to God is going to be allowed to come through that marriage. Yeah.
Well, that's what Ryan says. Yes.
Fair point.
Yeah.
Fair point.
That's what I wanted to say. And yeah, I mean, and there are other examples which make sense, but the thing is that they are made today, and at the same time, you will go to the books, and there's very, 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 very little written about Vargas.
Yes,
the majority are just things that where do these things come from? That's the question people have to ask themselves. And when you start looking, there's not a lot. And that's why many times when people teach Vargas, and once again, I took classes with 3 people, and the 3 people taught Vargas, taught Gemini in different ways. There are similarities, don't get me wrong, it's not very different, but certain things do not interchange, and then you go to the books and you say, wait a minute,
a lot of them
Gemini is just a puzzle. Gemini is a puzzle. And I do not know how to read Sanskrit. Let me just be clear about that.
Same here.
But the thing is that it is a puzzle, and people who study the book will tell you that, wait a minute, numbers are letters, letters are numbers, and there's really no real translation because it can be seen from different angles. So Gemini is a good example of how the Navamsha is used in certain techniques that originate in a text that's really difficult, because there is no longer a parampara, there's no longer a lineage in order to translate it correctly. Now, once again, to finish the question, this is why I do not use Vargas anymore. I haven't been using them for quite a while now. And what I tell people is that if you have a guru and he tells you to use Vargas, use them. If you are a devoted person who has a religious practice, use them. If you are a part of a lineage and you feel that it is correct from a traditional perspective, keep using it, because in the end, and this is like more of a karma idea, people who are destined to have a good astrological reading will have it, and people who are destined to have a bad astrological reading will have it. It doesn't matter the techniques of the astrology.
I do agree with that.
But the thing is that if you're part of a tradition, don't listen to me. But if you're not part of a tradition and you are really like trying to learn and trying to look for truth, then I would recommend that you look upon what I just said and you think about it, because the sidereal zodiac is a very, it's just wrong, and the idea of the nakshatras,
if you don't mind my asking,
and the idea of the subdivision between 27 and 28 is not necessarily wrong, but once again, there is problem there, because that's another thing that we haven't discussed, the idea of the 27 or 28.
Totally.
Lunar mansions exist in Muslim astrology, but they're 28, they're not 27.
Right, and that is
and that's another problem. And the Yogataras, Indians have a list, but Muslims have another, and Ptolemy had another. I mean, there are a lot of tricky things that once you get into it, you say, wait a minute, no. And with the zodiac, you already have a lot to work with, but a lot to work with,
right?
Because you get the essential dignities, which are not the same as in Indian astrology, where you get a whole nother outlook, and then you start there, and then you realize, wait a minute, Indian astrology is just Hellenistic astrology made the Indian way.
Cool.
But the important thing is that the living tradition only exists today in India, and that's something that even though it's in shambles, even though it's decadent, even though it's really difficult to access it,
dismantled by that
in what can be left of its pure form, it's very difficult. So I'm sorry if I extended myself, Dustin, but I just wanted to have this few minutes to explain myself.
Very good, Fernando. Thank you for putting it in the way you did. So I do want to, before we, I do want to ask one last question in regards to where you're at with the Vargas. Is your main reasoning behind letting go of the Vargas that there's just not enough, there's too much conjecture about it? Or is it because are you relating them? Are you asserting that their main prognosis is that the Vargas relate to the Nakshatras, which, since we've agreed that the Nakshatras are a very debatable thing because of the way of Ayanamsha and such things, are you saying that the Navamsha, for example, is a sidereal phenomenon? Because I don't think it necessarily is.
Well, it is only done in the sidereal. Well, the way they are done with the ascendant and the creation of charts is only done in India.
India.
The subdivisions of the circle can be done in many astrologies. But the idea of creating new charts
out of it
from the D1, that is only done in Indian astrology, India. And it stems from the sidereal perspective of the chart.
Yeah, like
Yes.
you must know from what we practice with Asheville Vedic Astrology,
Uh-huh.
the understanding that we got of how the Vargas are created is that they are
Subdivisions.
amshas, subdivisions
Yes.
of the Rashis. So assuming that tropical is its own thing and it has its 30 degrees within each Rashi, the subdivisions of the Navamsha chart given by Parashara can work in a tropical or a sidereal context, which means that using the Navamsha is not at all a sidereal phenomenon. So that's why, is your logic of not using the Navamsha, for example, is it simply that there's too much conjecture there? Or are you?
They're both.
Both. You're connecting it to the sidereal.
I'm sorry, sir?
You're connecting the Navamsha
yes,
to
because
sidereal.
it was originally a sidereal thing.
I understand what you're saying.
When the astrologers of India started alluding to the idea of subdividing charts and starting writing books, they were using a sidereal zodiac.
So yes, and
so like you have to understand this. So those techniques stem from that understanding. That today we say that they're part of the Rashis. Well, yes, they are. Well, but at the same time, they have a connection with the 27 nakshatras.
Because if I might I want to really, for my audience's sake, and I want to see if I'm following it correctly. There was a time when Ashwini, the sidereal star, was considered to line up with Aries, or rather, Aries was lined up to this nakshatra, Ashwini. Claro. And the idea...
It's not a nakshatra, it's a yogatara.
A yogatara.
Which is different. But
okay, I understand.
But the thing, that's another topic, because we really don't know the nakshatras. There's some nakshatras that we really don't know all the stars that are part of that nakshatra.
I am with you.
And the yogataras are something, the constellations are another thing, but the constellations come from the Hellenistic context, but sometimes the yogatara comes from so we don't know how particularly they mesh up.
But this is what I'm looking to convey here, Fernando, and thank you for your patience with me trying to get this out. My idea is that when Ashwini, in the sidereal tradition 3,000 years ago, sidereal people thought Ashwini always related to Aries, and so
it did for a while, and it did for a while.
Correct. So the idea at the time is that since the nakshatras are actually, if you divide 360 by 27, each nakshatra is about 3 degrees and 20 minutes of arc. And
it's exactly 3 minutes.
Exactly 3 minutes, 3 minutes and 20 seconds of arc. So what I'm saying, 3 degrees, 20 minutes of arc. Yes. So the nakshatras lined up at that time in their minds with the navamshas, so that if the sun fell at 5 degrees of Aries, it would be in the nakshatra after Ashwini. It's not coming to me right now. Would that be Rohini, I think?
But the problem is that's not correct, because
they were 28. I agree.
They were 28.
No,
they were not 27.
Fernando. So what I'm saying is, you're saying that this was happening and that it was incorrect. And at the time, they correlated the second nakshatra, which I'm thinking is Rohini, with the second Navamsha of Aries.
No, the
and there was an inherent
Bharani. It's Bharani.
Bharani. Thank you. I was trying to think of the right one. Thank you. So at the time, they would have considered that Bharani at a sun, for example, at 5 degrees of Aries would be in the nakshatra of Bharani. And they thought that the nakshatra of Bharani was inherently connected to the second Navamsha of Aries. Is that what you're saying? That is bogus?
We don't know.
Because that is bogus, but that doesn't necessarily say the second amsha of the second navamsha of Aries is not useful in the way Parashara has given it. Because I don't think Parashara connected the navamshas to the nakshatras in the way that the sidereal tradition does.
Yeah, the thing is that navamshas are not used in other schools of astrology.
Yes.
That's something that I have to emphasize, which I haven't said before. And what you're saying, the idea that it's the logic that they use in terms of the tropical signs and the sidereal signs. Now, we are saying that the sidereal positions also correspond to the sign, but
they thought they did. They thought that the sidereal position the sidereal nakshatra correlated to the navamsha. And what I'm saying is that they did at that time. And you're saying that we are scrapping the nakshatras. I'm with you on that. What I'm saying is that if we scrap the nakshatras, we can still use the Vargas as a valid.
Yeah, I don't use Vargas anymore.
So you just don't prefer to use them. But
no, I don't use an enemy anymore because there's no right way to read them. Everybody says something different about.
That's what I was wondering. It's the conjecture that's making you.
But at the same time, that logic, even though, you know, it's either or, but the thing is that we don't really know. And the idea of the subdivisionals, of creating charts out of subdivisionals, because subdivisions do exist in other dignities. But the idea of creating a chart with an ascendant and all that's very Indian. That's very Jyotish. And the way it represents, there are a lot of voids, there are a lot of unanswered questions. And, you know, instead of just looking for that answer, I just figured out I don't use them anymore. And at the same time, I don't use dashas. I don't use the only thing that I use it for is the compatibility.
Right, you were mentioning that for nakshatras.
And certain techniques in terms of the deity associated with the nakshatra of a certain planet, but even that I'm not using anymore because, you know, there's no right way of knowing what nakshatra planet is in, due to several factors, the 28, 27 count.
The nakshatras are definitely a mess, and I can understand you.
And the amshas and also subdivisionals to a certain degree because they do stem from sidereal interpretations and sidereal understanding of what those charts mean. Now that you say that they relate to tropical, yeah, I guess so. You could say that, but how come everybody explains them in different ways? You know, that's something very important.
Well, because that's why
then they say, well, we got to test them out. But that's not how astrology works.
Yeah, I do agree with that. That is certainly a danger these days. Although, you know,
I wouldn't say a danger. It's just modernity, right? But yeah, I don't use Vargas anymore. But once again, if you have a teacher, if you have somebody who teaches you, you should really.
And if there's a logic behind it.
No, and there is, but we don't know what it is. You know, we only know the meanings of the Vargas.
Right.
That's all we know. And I stress that because even the way we construct them is in doubt. I mean, there are different ways of constructing the Drekana. There are different ways of this.
That's why I personally like the big one.
The Hora, and the Hora per itself, you know, the Hora alludes to other terminology from Hellenistic astrology that really doesn't have to do with, you know, two. I mean, it has to do with 2, but it has to do more with 12 because it is alluding to the times of rising. You know, it's alluding to time. It's not necessarily alluding to a binomius situation in terms of how do you call it? By the zeros and the 1. How do you call that?
0, 1 binary.
Binary. It's not alluding to binary. So there are a lot of things that like I said before, you know, even though, and I think we didn't record this. I think we discussed this before we recorded the previous videos. You know, even though India is the only place with a living astrological tradition, you have to realize that there's no tradition. So it's like I said to you before, imagine that, you know, everybody knows who Iron Man is today, right? Everybody knows who the Avengers are today, right? Because it's part of the pop culture of today. So whatever, astrology was part of the culture beforehand, right? So imagine now we flash forward, 2,000 years in the future. And we are people who are trying to study, you know, the pop culture of the early 21st century. And we don't see anything. But the only place where sort of that still exists is in India. But you go to India, and you find Iron Man, but it's the head of Iron Man in the body of Darth Vader, and it is sold as Michelangelo of the Ninja Turtles in a package that says Power Rangers. So that is Vedic astrology.
Wonderful. That's a great
as we understand it today, and once you understand, wait a minute, that's Darth Vader, that's Star Wars, that's not Marvel, and wait a minute, that's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle that came after Star Wars,
right?
But then there was a Star Wars that came before. And Ninja Turtles. There were different movies, and then you see Power Rangers. Wait, Power Rangers is not Power Rangers. It's Super Sentai from Japan, and it started in the 1970s. And it's gonna have there's a lot of series, but it only started being, you know, that's the thing. When you get into Vedic astrology and you really understand the needs and crannies, there are a lot of things that do not make sense. And what do you do then? Well, you go to other traditions and you start seeing the chronology.
Dismantling,
because unfortunately, Vedic astrology today is taught in a historical void. And not only that, it is taught from a modern iconoclastic subversive perspective that everything Indian is better than everything that is west of Jerusalem. You know what I mean?
Right. No kidding.
And it's not like that. Even though it's traditional, even though it's still a living tradition, there are things that are not Indian that are in India, and there are things that are in India that only exist in India that are not Indian. And you have to, start to understand, and you understand this once again with this idea of knowing the modern from the traditional paradigm, knowing the history, knowing the chronology, knowing how it developed. And I'm not saying I'm an expert, because I am not that. But the thing is that with the sidereal zodiac, you start seeing that Indians are still using something that was discarded in the 4th, 5th century AD.
Yeah, totally.
Because people realized it back then. Wait a minute, doesn't make sense.
And
at the same time, Yogataras are not seen in other school of astrology. What you have are fixed stars, which is 1 point, not different, because Yogataras can be 1 star, but Yogataras can be a bunch of stars,
a little cluster, right?
So and at the same time, people in India didn't know about the precession of the equinoxes till very late. So there are a lot of things in India that are not perfect, quite the contrary. And unfortunately, in my opinion, this idea of Vargas, this idea of the sidereal zodiac, is something that I do not do anymore. But don't get me wrong, there are techniques in India that are very valid. I believe that, which is something that's very interesting, and I don't think it's been explored sufficiently. The idea of Raja Yoga, the Raja Yoga technique, I believe it makes a lot of sense. But how it is passed to the dashas, I don't agree with that. But there's something good there. Also, the whole analogies that we get for the planets, that's why Ernst's book Graha Sutras is so good, because important to understand the quality of the planets. I believe that the Indian lore is very good. The idea of the planetary cabinet, you don't get that in other places.
Totally.
That's an excellent metaphor. So there are good things in India. There are good things in Jyotish. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. I love the idea that, having that image of, for example, the face of you said it was the body of Darth Vader, and then who'd you say was the face?
Iron Man.
So you've got the face of Iron Man, and each one of the literature of Star Wars, for example, is very wonderful in its own right.
You mean the expanded universe?
Maybe.
What do you mean by literature? You mean the canon of Star Wars?
The canon of Star Wars. Really the idea that there's a hero and there's this bad thing.
Oh, you mean the hero's journey? The
hero's journey, right? This hero's journey is important in Star Wars. But if you take the characters of Star Wars and you mismatch it with the character of Iron Man and the character of Michelangelo from the Ninja Turtles, each one of those has their own cultural validity in the context of the premise of the story that was written underneath them. But when you mismatch them all together, this is a common thing that happened with Westerners studying yoga, for example.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a good example.
If I want to learn about the correlations between the Divine Mary consciousness of Western theology with, let's see if I can see it in Indian literature. And then I find the character of Lakshmi. And I think, Lakshmi's a lady, so maybe that's their Divine Mary. Really, Lakshmi is an abundance thing that has nothing to do with the Holy Spirit of the Mother Mary figure and what Mother Mary relates to Christ consciousness. But somebody who's looking for it in Indian literature can just say Lakshmi's close enough, but then A, what Lakshmi was supposed to mean gets diluted, and B, what Mother Mary means gets diluted.
Yeah, that's an example, yeah.
Right? And so this kind of thing happens all the time, and it's very cool that somebody like you, Fernando, is looking to discern this and try to make a spinal alignment between premise of culture and applied astrological method.
And I go by a saying, I started in martial arts more or less at the same time I started studying astrology, and I always take a lot from martial arts and apply it to astrology. Yeah. And my first teacher taught me, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Nice. and go for simple techniques. A person who dominates a simple technique is superior to anybody who has 10 and 9 and is always looking for a new technique. No. And if you really think about it, astrology is just about basics, about logic. Yeah. And even though the modern mind says, "Whoa, 12 signs, how can I explain this and that and that?" It's not about that. It's not about that at all. You know, the significations of the houses are perfect. Everything is there because nothing really changes. The thing that has changed is that you have been dumbed down. The normal person has been dumbed down, and then they don't understand as well as they don't understand a majority of things. So what I tell people is if you have a 12 box of crayons, that's enough to paint. And it's better to have 12 crayons. I mean, a box of 12 crayons and use them all perfectly and know what they are, than have a box of 120 and not know what half of them are for.
Congruency.
And the majority of them are just artificial, generic colors that have been invented very recently.
Wonderful.
With astrology, it's the same thing. If you know the basics, you're going to be the best astrologer, one of the best astrologer ever. And the thing with where we studied in Asheville is that's what mainly Ryan did. You know, Ryan really, the course is just about knowing the basics.
You're totally
and if you know the basics,
you can expand into your own thing.
You're just going to be better than half of the people who call themselves astrologers.
Right.
So that's what I mean. And when you're talking about, you know, Vargas and going, well, not Vargas, that's not a good example, but the idea of talking about 180 Vargas and starting talking about using different timing systems.
This whole dilution.
You know, I mean, no, man, it's much more simpler than that. It's much more simpler than that. And there's a lot there that we take for granted, that we say, oh, I know this, I know that. No. You gotta meditate upon what the third is, what Mars is, what the ascendant in Leo is. I mean, there's a lot there that we take for granted, and it's more important to understand that, and obviously, you know, taken by the hand from the background in history and the background in all you need to be a better astrologer. Then, you know, you have your hands full.
You really, I almost think like a good image for what we're talking about is that classic one in China, when they would be digging around for water. They're looking for water and to dig a good well. What they said is that, you know, don't waste your time digging 100 holes and try to find well water. What they said is dig one hole 100 feet deep and you'll get the water that you are seeking. So that's very good, Fernando. I think that, you know, we've had a long session here today, and that was kick butt, buddy. You always come on and your logic is always very clear. So I think this would have been a good video for us today, Fernando. What about you, buddy?
Oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah,
a good wrap up of all the questions I wanted to ask you. So,
I mean, there are other things that we left behind, but I think we can make it another one later on.
I was thinking so. We always could, you know. I almost like I was telling you earlier that I've been doing a series talking about informal astrological interviews of how you would do clients, how you approach doing clients. I'd love to have a conversation like that with you, buddy.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can do it.
You've got such knowledge to share and you do it in a passionate way. I'm very happy to have had you on my channel, Fernando.
Yeah. You're welcome, Dustin, and thank you for having me, and I hope I come back, and I wish all your audience, like I say in my Spanish videos, what I tell everybody when I end a video is I wish that you all, you know, peace, serenity, and wisdom.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Fernando. Right back at you. Thanks for everybody for watching, and we'll see you guys again.
Take care.